There exists a particular and devastating historical paradox, a paradox that emerges when substances synthesized in laboratories with the explicit intention of alleviating human suffering become instead the instruments through which civilizations inadvertently poison themselves on a massive scale. This is the story of heroin in 1920s Paris, a narrative that reveals how medical innovation, commercial ambition, cultural permissiveness, and human desperation converged to create the world's first modern drug epidemic, an epidemic that would establish patterns of addiction, criminalization, and social destruction that continue to haunt contemporary societies more than a century later. The heroin epidemic that engulfed Paris during the decade following World War I was not the result of criminal conspiracy or deliberate malice, but rather emerged from the collision between legitimate pharmaceutical development, aggressive commercial marketing, profound medical ignorance regarding addiction mechanisms, and a cultural environment uniquely susceptible to chemical solutions to emotional and existential challenges. The City of Light, celebrated as a beacon of artistic freedom and intellectual sophistication, became instead the proving ground for how a civilization could systematically addict itself to a powerful narcotic, while remaining convinced that the addiction represented progress, sophistication, and medical advancement. The origins of heroin as a pharmaceutical product extend back to the final decades of the 19th century, to a moment in the history of chemistry when scientific advancement seemed poised to solve fundamental problems of human suffering. In 1897, a chemist named Heinrich Dreser, working in the laboratories of the German pharmaceutical company Bayer, synthesized a substance derived from morphine through a process of chemical modification that was intended to produce a pain reliever more effective and safer than morphine itself. Dreser's innovation involved adding acetyl groups to morphine's molecular structure, a chemical modification that produced a compound of extraordinary potency and of extraordinary danger, though the danger would not become apparent for many years. The substance was named diacetylmorphine, but Bayer's marketing department provided the product with a far more evocative designation: heroin, derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, a name intended to convey the substance's capacity to produce feelings of power and capability in those who consumed it. The initial clinical trials conducted by Bayer in the years immediately following heroin synthesis appeared to validate the company's optimistic assessment of the substance's therapeutic potential. Patients treated with heroin reported remarkable relief from pain, dramatic improvements in mood, substantial increases in energy and focus, and a general sense of well-being and capability that exceeded what morphine or other available pain relievers could produce. The early clinical literature published by Bayer and by independent physicians who had obtained supplies of the substance for experimental use consistently reported positive outcomes and the absence of significant adverse effects. The medical establishment of the 1890s, operating without any understanding of addiction as a neurological phenomenon, without any framework for recognizing tolerance development or physical dependence, interpreted the effects of heroin through the lens of successful pain relief and successful treatment of various medical conditions. The substance appeared to represent a genuine advance in pharmaceutical science, a triumph of German chemical engineering applied to the problem of human suffering. The commercial expansion of heroin production and distribution occurred with remarkable rapidity in the years following its synthesis. By 1900, Bayer was manufacturing heroin in substantial quantities and was distributing it to pharmaceutical companies and medical professionals throughout Europe and North America. The marketing of heroin was systematic and was extraordinarily effective, employing sophisticated promotional strategies that emphasized the substance's scientific basis, its German origin, and its superiority to existing treatments for pain and various forms of nervous exhaustion. Bayer sponsored medical conferences, published research in prestigious medical journals, provided free samples to physicians, and engaged in what would now be recognized as aggressive direct-to-consumer marketing through advertisements in newspapers and magazines. By the early years of the 20th century, heroin had become one of the most widely prescribed medications in the world, available in pharmacies without prescription, incorporated into various patent medicines marketed directly to consumers, and established as a standard component of modern medical practice. The medical community's enthusiasm for heroin was nearly universal, and was based on genuine observation of therapeutic effects combined with complete ignorance of addiction mechanisms. Physicians prescribed heroin for pain, for cough, for anxiety, for depression, for insomnia, and for various forms of what was then termed nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia, conditions that encompassed a broad range of emotional and physical distress that physicians did not fully understand. The patients who received heroin experienced immediate relief from their symptoms, experienced mood elevation and increased energy, and returned to their physicians requesting continued access to the medication. Physicians observing these positive effects in their patients prescribed heroin with confidence, with the belief that they were providing modern scientific treatment for conditions that had previously been difficult or impossible to treat. The absence of any conceptual framework for understanding addiction meant that physicians could not recognize the obvious signs of tolerance development, physical dependence, and escalating dosage requirements as indicators of a serious problem. Instead, these signs were interpreted as evidence that the underlying medical condition was becoming more severe and required more intensive pharmaceutical intervention. The particular vulnerability of Paris to the heroin epidemic that would emerge in the 1920s was rooted in the city's unique position in the post-World War I world as a center of artistic freedom, cultural experimentation, and expatriate refuge. The war had devastated Europe, had created profound social disruption, had challenged fundamental assumptions about civilization and progress. In the aftermath of the war, Paris emerged as a destination for artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals from across the world who were seeking freedom from the constraints of their home societies, and seeking an environment in which creative and intellectual experimentation could flourish without conventional social restriction. The American expatriate community that emerged in Paris during the 1920s included some of the greatest literary and artistic talents of the era. Writers like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Hart Crane, painters like Gerald Murphy and Maxwell Bodenheim, musicians and other artists seeking refuge from Prohibition-era America, and from societies they experienced as restrictive and hostile to artistic expression. The economic conditions that made Paris particularly attractive to American expatriates in the 1920s were fortuitous, and were directly related to fluctuations in international currency exchange rates that rendered the French franc extraordinarily cheap relative to the American dollar. An American writer or artist could live in Paris on a fraction of what equivalent living expenses would require in New York or Chicago, could afford elegant apartments in fashionable neighborhoods, could spend hours in cafes without the pressure of employment that characterized life in the United States. The favorable exchange rates meant that even artists with minimal income could sustain themselves in Paris in comfort that would have been impossible in America. This economic advantage was combined with a cultural environment that celebrated artistic expression, that tolerated unconventional lifestyles and behaviors, that viewed the exploration of new forms of consciousness and new approaches to aesthetics as valuable pursuits rather than as threats to social order. The arrival of heroin in Paris occurred not as a dramatic transformation, but as a gradual integration of a pharmaceutical product that was legal, respectable, and marketed through legitimate medical channels. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured heroin, including Bayer, but also numerous other legitimate manufacturers in Germany, Switzerland, and other countries, continued to produce and distribute the substance freely despite growing evidence of addiction problems in various parts of the world. Pharmaceutical heroin arrived in Paris through the same distribution channels that brought all medications, through pharmacies, through physicians' prescriptions, through mail-order catalogs, and through direct commercial sale without prescription since regulation of pharmaceutical sales was minimal. The substance was expensive enough to be accessible primarily to people of some economic means, but was available to anyone with the money to purchase it and the motivation to do so. The initial consumers of heroin in Paris were not urban poor or marginalized populations, but rather were drawn from the educated, artistic, and relatively prosperous expatriate and Parisian communities. Writers seeking inspiration, artists attempting to manage creative anxiety, intellectuals interested in exploring altered states of consciousness, society women managing the stress of maintaining elegant appearances and complex social obligations, All of these populations found in heroin a pharmaceutical solution to various forms of psychological and physical distress. The substance was marketed through respectable medical channels, was prescribed by reputable physicians, and was embedded in a medical and cultural framework that presented it as modern, scientific, and sophisticated. The contrast between heroin and alcohol, which was illegal in the United States but was readily available in Paris, created a particular seduction for American expatriates who saw heroin as a European pharmaceutical alternative to the clandestine alcohol consumption that characterized American life. The early years of heroin use in Paris, roughly from 1920 to 1924, were characterized by what might be described as a honeymoon phase in which the substance's pleasurable and energizing effects were experienced by users without the full weight of addiction consequences yet becoming apparent. Writers described enhanced creativity, deeper aesthetic appreciation, and access to states of consciousness that seemed to provide genuine insight into human experience. Artists reported that heroin allowed them to work with greater focus and with access to emotional depths that informed their creative output. Society, women described the relief that heroin provided from the anxiety associated with maintaining perfect social performance. Musicians reported that heroin allowed them to perform with greater spontaneity and emotional authenticity. The testimonials and accounts that emerged during this period, preserved in letters, diaries, and published writings, consistently emphasize the positive effects of heroin on creativity, on emotional well-being, and on the capacity to engage more fully with aesthetic and intellectual pursuits. What users and the medical professionals who treated them could not yet recognize was that the positive effects of heroin were inseparable from the progressive development of physical and psychological dependence. The neurological mechanisms through which heroin produced pleasure, its interaction with opioid receptors in the brain, its stimulation of dopamine release in reward centers, its effect on the brain's perception of pain and stress, were completely unknown to 19th and early 20th century neuroscience. The fact that repeated heroin use led inevitably to tolerance, to the requirement for escalating doses to produce the same effects, to the development of physical dependence in which the body's normal functioning became dependent on the presence of the substance, and to powerful psychological craving when the substance was unavailable. All of these were not understood as necessary consequences of heroin's pharmacology, but were instead interpreted through various explanatory frameworks that prevented recognition of addiction as the fundamental problem. The explanatory frameworks that physicians and users developed to account for escalating heroin consumption were remarkably consistent across different contexts and different populations. When users required higher doses to achieve the same effects, this was interpreted as evidence that the underlying condition for which heroin was being used, nervousness, anxiety, depression, creative frustration, was becoming more severe and required more intensive pharmaceutical intervention. When users experienced distress when they attempted to reduce or discontinue heroin use, this distress was interpreted as evidence that the underlying condition had returned and that continued heroin use was medically necessary. When users expressed powerful cravings for heroin and organized their daily activities around obtaining and consuming the substance, this was interpreted as evidence of the severity of the condition being treated rather than as evidence of addiction to the medication itself. The circular logic was nearly perfect in its capacity to prevent recognition of what was actually occurring, the progressive development of addiction disguised as the escalation of underlying medical conditions. The cultural context in which heroin use became increasingly common in Paris during the mid-1920s was one in which altered consciousness, unconventional behavior, and the exploration of new forms of experience were celebrated as aspects of artistic and intellectual authenticity. The culture of Paris in the 1920s, particularly the culture of artistic and intellectual communities, placed enormous value on breaking free from bourgeois conventions, on challenging conventional morality, on exploring the boundaries of human experience through various means including chemical substances. The use of drugs and alcohol was viewed by many members of the artistic and intellectual elite not as a failure of character or as a sign of weakness, but rather as evidence of sensitivity, of artistic dedication, of willingness to sacrifice personal well-being for the pursuit of aesthetic truth. In this cultural context, the escalating use of heroin could be rationalized not as addiction but as artistic exploration, as the pursuit of enhanced consciousness, as the necessary sacrifice that artistic creation demanded of those serious enough to pursue it fully. The transformation of heroin use from a marginal phenomenon, affecting individual artists and intellectuals, into something approaching an epidemic began around 1924 and accelerated through the middle years of the decade. The precise mechanisms through which heroin use spread through Paris's artistic and expatriate communities are difficult to reconstruct with complete accuracy, but appear to have involved multiple intersecting pathways of transmission. Writers and artists who had begun using heroin shared their experiences with friends and acquaintances, creating networks of heroin users that expanded through social connections and through the recommendation of the substance by those who were experiencing its pleasurable effects. As heroin use became more common, it became increasingly normalized within artistic circles, increasingly integrated into the social rituals and cultural practices that define participation in artistic communities. The role of jazz music and jazz culture in normalizing heroin use in Paris was particularly significant and reveals how cultural forms can become inextricably linked with chemical consumption in ways that make it difficult to distinguish between the authentic aesthetic experience and the pharmacologically mediated experience. Jazz arrived in Paris with American soldiers following World War I and experienced an explosive growth in popularity during the 1920s, becoming the dominant form of popular music and becoming deeply associated with African American culture, with artistic rebellion, and with the rejection of conventional bourgeois values. Jazz was perceived as the sound of freedom, as the musical expression of authentic human emotion, as a form of artistic expression that demanded spontaneity and emotional depth. The musicians who performed jazz, many of whom were heroin users, became cultural icons whose embrace of both jazz music and heroin became culturally linked as expressions of the same fundamental commitment to authentic artistic expression and to breaking free from conventional constraints. The integration of heroin into jazz culture created a feedback loop in which the use of heroin became understood as part of authentic jazz musicianship, as a means of achieving the emotional depth and spontaneity that jazz demanded. Young musicians coming to Paris to study and to perform were exposed to heroin use through their involvement in jazz communities, were encouraged to try the substance by more established musicians who presented heroin use as a normal and even necessary aspect of serious musical pursuit. The cultural association between heroin and jazz performance created a situation in which refusing heroin could be experienced as a rejection of authentic musicianship, as a failure to commit fully to artistic truth. The musicians who performed heroin-enhanced jazz and who became successful in Paris became models for other musicians, establishing a pattern in which heroin use and musical success became culturally linked in the minds of aspiring performers. The role of Paris's jazz clubs and cabarets in creating spaces in which heroin consumption could occur within social contexts that normalized and celebrated the practice was crucial to the expansion of heroin use beyond individual users to more widespread consumption. The clubs that featured jazz performances and that catered to the artistic and expatriate communities of Paris became locations where heroin use could occur relatively openly, where the consumption of heroin could be integrated into the social experience of attending clubs, listening to music, and participating in the cultural life of artistic Paris. The clubs themselves developed cultures in which heroin use was tolerated, and in which the provision of spaces and facilities for heroin consumption became part of what the clubs offered to their customers. Some club owners actively facilitated heroin use among their customers, recognizing that heroin-dependent individuals would return repeatedly and would spend money in their establishments to purchase drinks and food while consuming heroin in the club's spaces. The economic dimensions of heroin's expansion in Paris reveal how the development of a market for an addictive substance creates powerful economic incentives for the expansion of that market and for the recruitment of new consumers. As heroin use became more widespread, as more people became dependent on the substance, as the demand for heroin increased, the economic rewards for those involved in supplying heroin increased proportionally. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured heroin saw no reason to restrict production as long as it remained legal and profitable. The physicians who prescribed heroin saw their patient populations expanding and saw the opportunity to generate substantial income through treating heroin-dependent patients who required frequent appointments and regular prescription refills. The the pharmacies that stocked and sold heroin saw their sales of the substance increase dramatically. The black market dealers who began to emerge as the decade progressed, and as pharmaceutical supplies became somewhat constrained, saw enormous profit opportunities in supplying heroin to those who could not or did not want to obtain it through pharmaceutical channels. The expansion of heroin use in Paris during the mid-1920s created a situation in which the substance became increasingly woven into the fabric of Parisian life, increasingly present in social spaces and cultural institutions, increasingly normalized as a normal aspect of urban existence. By 1925, it had become possible to walk into a pharmacy on some of Paris's most elegant streets and purchase heroin with minimal formality, to attend jazz clubs and social gatherings where heroin use was occurring openly or semi-openly, to move through artistic and intellectual communities in which heroin consumption was common enough to be unremarkable. The transformation had occurred gradually enough that most people involved in the process could not perceive it as a dramatic shift, but rather experienced it as the gradual normalization of a substance that was, after all, legal and pharmaceutical, and therefore respectable. The absence of any organized public health response to the emerging epidemic during these early years reflected both the newness of the phenomenon and the lack of any conceptual framework within which the medical establishment could recognize what was occurring. Public health officials and government authorities had no experience with pharmaceutical addiction on a large scale, and had no mechanisms for detecting or responding to such a phenomenon. The few medical professionals who began to notice patterns of escalating heroin use among their patients tended to attribute these patterns to the severity of the underlying conditions they were treating rather than to the addictive properties of the medication. The cultural prestige associated with heroin use in artistic circles, the economic interests of those profiting from heroin production and distribution, and the general cultural permissiveness toward chemical experimentation all created barriers to the recognition of heroin as a serious public health problem. The years 1924 through 1926 represented the peak expansion of heroin use in Paris, the period during which heroin consumption grew most rapidly, and during which the substance became most thoroughly integrated into the cultural, social, and economic life of the city. By 1926, heroin had moved from being a substance used by a marginal minority of artists and experimenters to being a substance that was consumed by people across multiple social classes, multiple professions, and multiple neighborhoods. The expansion of heroin use during this period created the conditions that would eventually precipitate the crisis that would come to dominate Paris during the final years of the decade, and that would eventually force governmental and international responses. The communities most affected by the heroin epidemic that emerged in Paris during the mid-1920s included artistic populations, expatriate populations, society women, working-class populations seeking escape from difficult circumstances, and musicians seeking to enhance their performances. The heterogeneity of heroin users in Paris, the fact that the substance attracted people from diverse social classes and from diverse circumstances, meant that the heroin epidemic affected multiple distinct communities in different ways, and meant that the visibility of the epidemic varied depending on which communities one observed. The heroin use that occurred among wealthy society women and among respected artists and writers might be conducted with sufficient discretion that it remained relatively invisible to the broader public. The heroin use that occurred among working-class populations might be more visible and more subject to police attention. The heroin use that occurred among musicians and in jazz clubs might be celebrated as part of artistic culture or might be condemned as evidence of moral degeneracy, depending on the perspective of the observer. The particular vulnerability of American expatriates in Paris to heroin addiction was related to multiple intersecting factors. The expatriates were often people who had left their home country precisely because they experienced it as restrictive and oppressive, people who were seeking freedom from conventional social constraints, and who were therefore more likely to be receptive to unconventional behaviors and to experimental approaches to consciousness and experience. The expatriates often experienced significant psychological stress related to their separation from their home countries, related to their uncertain social status in France, related to the existential challenges of living as foreigners in a foreign land. The heroin that was available in Paris offered a chemical solution to this psychological distress, offered the possibility of chemical happiness and chemical relief from the anxieties of expatriate existence. The relative ease with which heroin could be obtained in Paris, the legal status of the substance, and the cultural acceptance of heroin use in artistic circles meant that American expatriates had easier access to heroin than they would have had in the United States, where the substance was being increasingly criminalized. The role of gender in shaping patterns of heroin use in Paris reveals important dimensions of the epidemic that are often overlooked in historical accounts that focus primarily on artistic and bohemian communities. Women in Paris, and particularly women from the American expatriate and artistic communities, used heroin in significant numbers and were subjected to particular forms of vulnerability related to their gender. Women seeking to manage anxiety, depression, or the stress of maintaining acceptable feminine appearance and behavior in a society that maintained rigid standards for proper female conduct found in heroin a pharmaceutical solution to these challenges. Women in artistic communities seeking to maintain creative productivity while managing the emotional and physical demands of artistic work used heroin for similar reasons that male artists did. But women also faced particular pressures related to their reproductive biology, with heroin being prescribed by physicians for menstrual discomfort, for menopausal symptoms, and for various other forms of female-specific distress. The particular vulnerability of society women to heroin addiction was related to the extraordinary psychological pressures that were inherent in the role of the society woman in 1920s Paris. These women were expected to maintain perfect physical appearance, to manage complex households and social obligations, to support their husbands' social and business interests, to host elaborate social events, and to participate in the cultural life of Paris without appearing to have interests or ambitions of their own. The psychological toll of maintaining this impossible standard was substantial, and heroin offered a chemical solution that allowed these women to appear serene and composed while internally managing significant emotional distress. The heroin use of society women was often conducted with greater secrecy than the heroin use of artists and bohemians, conducted in private homes and in exclusive medical clinics rather than in public spaces, and was therefore less visible to the broader public but was nonetheless widespread and was producing profound consequences for the women involved and for their families. The expansion of heroin use among working-class populations in Paris reflected the appeal of heroin as a means of managing the physical and emotional stress of industrial labor, poverty, and the difficult circumstances of working-class existence. Working-class people used heroin to manage pain associated with labor, to manage the psychological distress of poverty and economic insecurity, and to escape temporarily from the difficult circumstances of their lives. The heroin that was available to working-class populations was often of lower quality and higher cost relative to income than the heroin available to wealthier populations, meaning that working-class heroin users faced particular challenges in maintaining their addiction while meeting basic survival needs. The visibility of working-class heroin use in public spaces and the association of heroin use with criminal activity and with lower-class populations contributed to the emergence of class-based distinctions in how heroin use was perceived and how heroin users were treated by authorities. The medical profession's response to the emerging heroin epidemic during the mid-1920s was characterized by continued confidence in heroin's therapeutic value, combined with bewilderment at the apparent increase in nervous conditions and addiction-like presentations among their patients. Physicians continued to prescribe heroin for various medical conditions and continued to believe that they were providing appropriate medical care. Some physicians began to notice that their patients were requiring higher doses of heroin to achieve the same therapeutic effects, that patients were becoming distressed when heroin prescriptions were delayed or refused, that some patients appeared to be organizing their lives around obtaining and consuming heroin. But the medical explanatory framework that was available to physicians, the framework that interpreted these symptoms as evidence of severe underlying medical conditions rather than as evidence of addiction to the medication, prevented most physicians from recognizing that they were creating rather than treating addiction. The few physicians who did begin to recognize the addictive properties of heroin, and who attempted to alert their colleagues to the problem, encountered significant resistance and skepticism. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured and profited from heroin prescription actively worked to suppress evidence of addiction problems and to maintain the medical establishment's confidence in heroin's therapeutic value. The prestige and economic success of physicians who prescribed heroin extensively created resistance to any suggestion that the substance was problematic. The cultural prestige associated with heroin in artistic circles and the integration of heroin into the social practices of educated and artistic populations created resistance to any suggestion that heroin use was pathological rather than sophisticated. The combination of these factors meant that the medical profession continued to prescribe heroin extensively throughout the mid-1920s, continuing to fuel the expansion of the epidemic despite accumulating evidence of serious problems. The transformation of heroin distribution from primarily pharmaceutical channels to increasingly black market channels occurred gradually during the mid to late 1920s as pharmaceutical supplies of heroin became somewhat constrained, and as demand for the substance continued to expand. The black market in heroin that emerged during this period operated not through traditional criminal organizations, but rather through networks of artists, musicians, and other individuals who had become dependent on heroin and who recognized opportunities to profit by distributing the substance to others. These small-scale dealers often operated from artistic studios or from the back rooms of cafes and jazz clubs, often maintained personal relationships with their customers, often rationalized their distribution activities as simply making the substance available to friends and acquaintances who desired it. The emergence of these small-scale black market networks reflected the reality that legal pharmaceutical supplies of heroin were insufficient to meet the rapidly expanding demand for the substance. The economics of heroin distribution in Paris during the mid-1920s reveal how the expansion of demand for an addictive substance creates powerful incentives for the expansion of supply, and how the development of addiction markets creates economic opportunities for a wide range of participants. The small-scale dealers who emerged during this period were not sophisticated criminals, but rather were people seeking to profit from their access to heroin and from the demand they observed among their social networks. Some dealers obtained heroin through pharmaceutical channels by misrepresenting themselves or by cultivating relationships with pharmacists or physicians who were willing to provide them with supplies. Other dealers obtained heroin through early black market suppliers who were importing the substance from international sources. The dealers sold heroin at prices that were higher than pharmaceutical prices, but that were lower than what desperate users without pharmaceutical access would eventually be forced to pay as supplies became more constrained. The geographic distribution of heroin use and heroin dealing in Paris during the mid-1920s was not random, but rather reflected the concentration of artistic and expatriate populations in particular neighborhoods and the development of specific locations that became known as centers of heroin distribution and consumption. The Montmartre district, historically the center of Parisian artistic culture and home to numerous jazz clubs, cabarets, and artistic studios, became particularly identified with heroin use and with heroin distribution. The neighborhood's winding streets, its concentration of artistic and expatriate populations, its cultural prestige and tourist appeal, and its relative tolerance for unconventional behavior all made it an ideal location for the expansion of heroin markets. By the mid-1920s, it was possible to obtain heroin relatively easily in Montmartre, either through remaining pharmaceutical sources or through the emerging black market dealers. The integration of heroin into Paris's nightlife and entertainment culture during this period reflected the convergence of heroin's growing popularity, the cultural prestige of heroin use in artistic circles, and the economic incentives that motivated establishments to accommodate heroin consumption. Jazz clubs, cabarets, and other entertainment venues began to create spaces and to develop practices that facilitated heroin consumption among their customers, recognizing that heroin-dependent individuals would return repeatedly and would consume drinks and food while using heroin in the establishment. Some venues developed relationships with dealers who would supply heroin to customers, allowing the venue to profit indirectly from heroin distribution. The integration of heroin into Paris's entertainment culture created a situation in which heroin consumption became interwoven with the experience of Parisian nightlife, and with the cultural life of the city in ways that normalized heroin use, and that made it difficult to distinguish between the aesthetic experience of attending a jazz club and the pharmacological experience of heroin consumption. The social impacts of expanding heroin use in Paris during the mid-1920s were becoming increasingly evident to those who were paying attention, though the broader Parisian society remained largely oblivious to the scope and severity of the emerging epidemic. Writers, artists, and others in close contact with heroin users observed increasing numbers of people whose lives were becoming organized around heroin consumption, increasing numbers of people whose creativity and productivity were declining despite initial promises that heroin would enhance their work, increasing numbers of people who were withdrawing from social participation and from productive engagement. The intimate relationships and family structures of heroin-dependent people were beginning to show signs of strain as the demands of heroin dependency competed with the demands of maintaining relationships and family responsibilities. The absence of any organized public health response to the emerging heroin epidemic during the mid-1920s reflected the newness of the phenomenon, the lack of any precedent for pharmaceutical addiction on such a scale, and the multiple barriers to recognition of heroin as a problem. The medical establishment continued to prescribe heroin as though it were an appropriate and effective medication despite the accumulating evidence of addiction problems. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured heroin continued to promote the substance and to profit from its sale despite the obvious evidence that widespread addiction was occurring. The cultural institutions that had integrated heroin into their practices continued to accommodate heroin consumption and to profit from the presence of heroin users. The governmental authorities that might have been expected to respond to the emerging public health crisis had not yet developed any awareness that a crisis existed or any conceptual framework for understanding what was occurring. The transition from the growth phase of the heroin epidemic to the crisis phase occurred gradually during 1926 and accelerated through 1927, as the consequences of widespread heroin addiction became increasingly visible and increasingly difficult to ignore. The trajectory of heroin use in individual users tended to follow a consistent pattern that, when multiplied across thousands of people, created an escalating public health crisis. Users who began heroin consumption reported initial positive effects: pain relief, mood elevation, increased energy and focus, relief from anxiety and depression. Continued use led to tolerance, to the requirement for higher and more frequent doses to achieve the same effects, and to the gradual development of physical and psychological dependence in which the user's body adapted to the constant presence of the substance, and in which the user's psychological state became dependent on heroin consumption. As dependence deepened, users who attempted to discontinue heroin use experienced severe withdrawal symptoms, physical discomfort, intense anxiety, depression, and powerful psychological cravings. The withdrawal symptoms created powerful incentives to continue using heroin, incentives that overwhelmed the user's rational intentions to reduce or discontinue use. The recognition of the heroin epidemic by public health authorities began to crystallize in 1926 and 1927, when death rates attributed to heroin use began to spike dramatically, and when the emergency rooms of Paris hospitals began to overflow with patients presenting with overdose symptoms, and with the various medical complications of heroin addiction. The autopsy reports and death certificate data compiled by the Paris Medical Examiner's Office revealed an alarming trend in mortality among people in their 20s and 30s, a demographic that would normally be expected to have very low mortality rates. The Medical Examiner's Office documented that heroin-related deaths increased by more than 800% between 1922 and 1926, though many of these deaths were not explicitly attributed to heroin on death certificates, but were attributed instead to various cardiac, respiratory, or other conditions that were actually heroin-related. The visibility of heroin's destructive effects on artistic and creative productivity also became increasingly undeniable during this period. Writers who had initially reported that heroin enhanced their creative capacity were now struggling to produce coherent work, were producing pages of repetitive and meaningless prose, were abandoning projects that they had been working on for years. Artists who had used heroin to manage creative anxiety were now unable to access the emotional resources necessary for authentic artistic creation, were producing technically competent but emotionally hollow works, or had abandoned artistic practice altogether. Musicians who had attributed their early success to heroin-enhanced performance were now unable to perform without heroin and were experiencing declining musical abilities and declining capacity to generate innovative musical ideas. The initial promise that heroin would enhance creativity was being replaced by the reality that heroin was systematically destroying the creative capacity of those who had come to depend on it. The family impacts of widespread heroin addiction became increasingly visible during 1927 and 1928, as the consequences of parental heroin addiction began to manifest in the lives of children and spouses of heroin users. Families in which one or more adults had become heroin dependent were experiencing economic crises as resources that should have been devoted to food, housing, and other necessities were instead devoted to purchasing heroin. Marital relationships were deteriorating as partners attempted to cope with spouses whose emotional availability fluctuated with pharmaceutical schedules and whose commitment to obtaining heroin superseded commitment to family relationships. Children were adapting to environments in which parental behavior and parental emotional availability depended on pharmaceutical administration, and in which family stability required constant management of the unpredictable emotional states of heroin-dependent parents. The emergence of serious social disorder in neighborhoods with high concentrations of heroin use reflected the reality that heroin addiction created powerful incentives for illegal and destructive behavior. Heroin-dependent individuals who could not afford to purchase heroin through legal pharmaceutical channels or through black market dealers began to commit crimes to obtain the money necessary to purchase heroin. The property crime rates in neighborhoods with high heroin use began to increase dramatically as desperate people stole from their neighbors, from their employers, from their families to obtain the money necessary to fund their heroin addiction. The emergence of heroin-driven crime created pressure on the police and on other authorities to respond to the emerging crisis. The media coverage of the heroin epidemic began to shift in tone and content during 1927 and 1928 as the crisis became increasingly undeniable. Earlier coverage that had sometimes portrayed heroin use as a somewhat romantic aspect of artistic bohemian culture gave way to coverage that emphasized the dangers and the destructiveness of heroin addiction. Newspaper and magazine articles began to document the cases of prominent artists and writers whose heroin addiction had led to their decline, and whose productivity and creative output had been devastated by the drug. The transformation in media coverage reflected a broader shift in public perception, as the initial cultural prestige associated with heroin use gave way to recognition of heroin as a serious threat to individual health and to public order. The growing awareness of the heroin epidemic created political pressure on the French government to respond to the crisis. Interior Minister Albert Sarraut, recognizing that the heroin epidemic had become a matter of significant public concern, and that the government's failure to address the crisis could become a political liability, began to convene meetings with medical professionals, law enforcement officials, and other experts to develop a response to the epidemic. The initial governmental response was characterized by a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the problem, and by the adoption of an approach that would prove to be catastrophically misguided. Rather than approaching heroin addiction as a medical problem requiring medical solutions, the government approached heroin as a supply problem requiring a supply-side solution. The government's conviction was that if heroin could be eliminated from the market, the epidemic would simply disappear. The governmental response to the heroin epidemic came in the form of a sudden and complete prohibition of heroin that was implemented in March 1927 with minimal warning, and with no transition period or preparation for the massive disruption that the prohibition would create. On March 15, 1927, the French government declared that heroin was henceforth illegal, and that all production, distribution, and possession of heroin would be subject to criminal penalties. The prohibition was intended to eliminate heroin use by eliminating heroin supply, an approach that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of addiction as a biological and psychological phenomenon. The government's assumption was that people who could not obtain heroin would simply stop using it, would return to normal functioning, would resume productive and socially integrated lives. The reality would prove to be far more complex and far more devastating. The immediate consequence of heroin prohibition was the creation of a humanitarian crisis among the many thousands of people in Paris who had become physically dependent on heroin, and who suddenly found themselves unable to obtain the substance that their bodies had become dependent upon. The physical withdrawal from heroin is an extraordinarily unpleasant process that, while rarely lethal in young healthy individuals, produces severe physical discomfort and psychological distress that is nearly unbearable. Within hours of their last heroin dose, dependent individuals begin to experience symptoms including severe muscle pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, insomnia, and intense psychological anxiety and depression. The withdrawal symptoms intensify over several days and can persist in some form for weeks. The psychological craving for heroin that accompanies withdrawal is extraordinarily powerful and creates an almost irresistible drive to obtain the substance by whatever means necessary. The hospitals and clinics of Paris were overwhelmed within days of the heroin prohibition, with patients presenting with severe withdrawal symptoms. The emergency rooms that had previously been dealing with heroin overdose cases now found themselves dealing with acute withdrawal cases, with patients in severe physical and psychological distress, with people seeking medical relief from the consequences of suddenly losing access to heroin. The medical establishment had no protocols for managing heroin withdrawal, had no medications that could effectively treat withdrawal symptoms, had no experience in helping people overcome heroin addiction. Some physicians and some clinics attempted to help heroin-dependent patients by gradually reducing their heroin doses, but this approach was constrained by the fact that heroin was now illegal and was therefore no longer available through legitimate pharmaceutical channels. The emergence of a black market in heroin following Prohibition occurred with remarkable rapidity, as criminal organizations and small-scale dealers recognized the enormous profit opportunities created by the sudden elimination of legal supply, and by the persistent demand from people who remained physically dependent on heroin. The black market heroin that emerged in Paris following Prohibition was very different from the pharmaceutical-grade heroin that had been available through legitimate channels. The black market heroin was often adulterated with dangerous substances, often of unpredictable potency, and often produced through crude synthesis processes that introduced dangerous contaminants. Users had no way of knowing the potency of the heroin they were purchasing and were therefore at constant risk of overdose. The quality control mechanisms that had existed when heroin was produced by legitimate pharmaceutical companies under regulatory oversight were completely absent from black market heroin production. The criminalization of heroin possession and use created a second humanitarian crisis, in which people who were attempting to manage their heroin addiction found themselves subject to criminal prosecution and imprisonment. The police began to conduct raids on suspected heroin dealers, and on locations where heroin consumption was known to occur. Individuals found in possession of heroin or found to be using heroin were arrested and subjected to criminal prosecution. The arrest records from Paris during 1927 and 1928 reveal that thousands of people were arrested for heroin-related offenses, many of them people who were simply attempting to manage their own dependence rather than people who were engaged in heroin distribution as a primary criminal activity. The criminalization of heroin users meant that people struggling with addiction had to choose between remaining hidden and attempting to obtain medical help, between exposing themselves to criminal prosecution and suffering the physical and psychological consequences of heroin withdrawal. The transformation of heroin from a legal pharmaceutical substance to an illegal criminal substance occurred in the minds of society as well as in the legal code. The heroin users who had previously been viewed as patients receiving treatment for medical conditions or as bohemians engaged in artistic and cultural experimentation were now increasingly viewed as criminals, as people whose behavior was morally reprehensible, as people whose difficulties were the consequence of moral failing rather than of pharmaceutical addiction. The social stigma associated with heroin use intensified dramatically following criminalization, making it even more difficult for people struggling with heroin addiction to seek help, to disclose their situation to family members and friends, or to access any form of legitimate social support. The absence of any established treatment protocols for heroin addiction meant that the medical profession was essentially powerless to help people who wanted to overcome heroin dependence. The handful of clinics that attempted to help heroin users by gradually reducing their heroin doses through a process of pharmaceutical tapering were operating illegally since they were prescribing heroin after it had been made illegal. The few physicians who believed that heroin addiction was a medical condition requiring medical treatment rather than a criminal condition requiring punishment found themselves operating outside the established medical and legal frameworks, and risking criminal prosecution themselves if they attempted to prescribe heroin or to conduct treatment programs that involved heroin. The economic disruption created by heroin prohibition was massive and affected not just the heroin users themselves, but also the entire ecosystem of people and businesses that had developed around heroin distribution and consumption. The jazz clubs and entertainment venues that had accommodated heroin consumption lost their heroin-dependent customer base either to incarceration or to withdrawal, or to the chaotic circumstances of attempting to obtain heroin on black markets. The property crime that emerged from desperation to obtain heroin disrupted neighborhoods and created general social disorder. The resources devoted to law enforcement and criminal prosecution of heroin users diverted resources from other public safety and public health priorities. The international dimensions of the heroin crisis in Paris emerged clearly in 1927 and 1928, as foreign observers and diplomatic representatives recognized that the situation in Paris represented not merely a French problem, but potentially an example of what could occur in their own countries if heroin addiction spread unchecked. The League of Nations, the international organization that had been established following World War I to maintain international peace and to coordinate responses to international issues, convened a special session to address what had become known as the pharmaceutical dependency crisis. The meeting brought together representatives from multiple countries who were concerned about the possibility that heroin addiction might spread from Paris to their own nations, and who were seeking to develop coordinated international responses to what was now recognized as a potentially global problem. The international response to the heroin crisis took the form of the International Opium Convention, a treaty negotiated and signed in December 1928 that aimed to create a coordinated international approach to the control of heroin and other dangerous drugs. The convention declared that heroin was an inherently dangerous substance that should be eliminated from global circulation, that the production, distribution, and possession of heroin should be criminalized in all signatory nations, and that international efforts should be coordinated to eliminate heroin trafficking and heroin use worldwide. The convention represented the first attempt at creating an international drug control regime and established principles that would govern international drug policy for decades to come. The international prohibition of heroin that was established through the treaty was based on the same fundamental misunderstanding that had motivated the French government's prohibition: the belief that heroin could be eliminated by eliminating the supply, the belief that prohibition would lead to the elimination of heroin use rather than to the transformation of heroin markets and the emergence of criminal heroin trafficking. The international community, observing the apparent success of French criminalization in eliminating legal heroin distribution, while remaining largely unaware of the humanitarian consequences of prohibition and of the emergence of black market heroin trafficking, endorsed the prohibition approach and worked to implement it in their own nations. The consequence of international heroin prohibition was the creation of conditions that would allow the emergence of the first truly global black market in drugs. The elimination of legal pharmaceutical heroin production and distribution created an enormous market opportunity for criminal organizations that were willing to engage in the synthesis, trafficking, and distribution of heroin outside of legal frameworks. The organizations that emerged to exploit this market opportunity developed sophisticated networks for sourcing opium from producing regions, for synthesizing opium into heroin through clandestine laboratory operations, and for trafficking heroin across international borders to markets where demand remained high. The networks that developed during this period, networks that connected opium producers in Asia with heroin manufacturers in Europe and with heroin distributors in North America and elsewhere, established patterns of international drug trafficking that would persist and evolve throughout the 20th century. The shift from pharmaceutical heroin distribution to criminal black market distribution created a situation in which the quality, safety, and composition of heroin became completely unpredictable. The pharmaceutical heroin that had been produced by Bayer and other legitimate manufacturers under regulatory oversight had been produced to consistent standards with consistent purity and potency. The black market heroin that emerged following prohibition was produced without any quality control, often contained dangerous adulterants, and had potency that varied dramatically from batch to batch. The users who purchased black market heroin had no way of knowing its actual composition or potency and were therefore at constant risk of overdose. The mortality rates associated with heroin use increased dramatically following Prohibition as users overdosed on heroin of unexpectedly high potency. The emergence of organized crime organizations as the primary distributors of heroin following Prohibition represented a dramatic shift from the relatively decentralized, small-scale distribution networks that had characterized heroin supply during the pharmaceutical era. The criminal organizations that entered the heroin trafficking business were willing to use violence to protect their market share, to eliminate competitors, and to ensure compliance with their pricing and distribution requirements. The emergence of heroin-driven organized crime created new forms of social disorder and new categories of violence associated with the competition to control heroin markets. The neighborhoods that had been centers of heroin consumption and distribution during the pharmaceutical era became sites of gang violence and organized criminal activity during the black market era. The impact of heroin prohibition on the treatment and management of heroin addiction was devastating. The medical approach to addiction that had been attempted by some physicians and clinics during the pharmaceutical era, gradual reduction of heroin doses under medical supervision, maintenance therapy that would allow addicted individuals to remain functional while they gradually reduced their heroin consumption, became impossible after Prohibition made heroin illegal. The few physicians and clinics that attempted to continue these approaches to treating heroin addiction found themselves operating outside the law and risking criminal prosecution. The absence of any legal framework for the medical treatment of heroin addiction meant that the only options available to heroin-dependent individuals were either to attempt to stop using heroin abruptly and endure severe withdrawal symptoms, to enter one of the few illegal clinics that were attempting to help people overcome addiction, or to obtain heroin through black market sources and continue their addiction. The societal response to the heroin crisis shifted from viewing heroin users as patients requiring medical care to viewing heroin users as criminals requiring punishment. The criminal justice system became the primary mechanism through which society attempted to respond to heroin use, with the result that vast numbers of people struggling with heroin addiction were incarcerated rather than treated. The incarceration of heroin users had the effect of disrupting any existing social support systems and family relationships that might have helped to sustain the user, of introducing the person to criminal networks and criminal culture within prisons, and of making it even more difficult for the person to reintegrate into society following release from incarceration. The collapse of the economic systems that had supported Paris and that had made the city an attractive destination for expatriates occurred in October 1929 with the stock market crash that precipitated the Great Depression. The economic catastrophe that followed the stock market crash created conditions that intersected with the heroin crisis in ways that multiplied the suffering and devastation already being created by the heroin epidemic and by the prohibition policies that the French government had implemented in response to the epidemic. The expatriates whose financial resources had been decimated by the stock market crash found themselves unable to afford the increasingly expensive black market heroin that was the only source available to them following Prohibition. The economic desperation that resulted from the Depression combined with heroin addiction created a population of people who were simultaneously addicted to an expensive drug, economically destitute, and criminalized for their addiction. The behavioral responses of heroin-dependent people to the combined crisis of heroin prohibition and economic collapse during the Depression revealed the power of addiction to drive behavior in ways that override other human considerations and that lead people toward increasingly desperate and increasingly dangerous choices. People who were experiencing withdrawal from heroin and who lacked the financial resources to purchase black market heroin were forced to choose between enduring severe withdrawal symptoms and committing crimes to obtain the money necessary to purchase heroin. The crime rates that had increased following heroin prohibition increased even more dramatically during the Depression, as more people found themselves in situations of economic desperation combined with heroin addiction. The property crimes, thefts, robberies, and other offenses that emerged from heroin-driven desperation increased dramatically, as did the violence associated with these crimes. The response of the criminal justice system to the explosion of heroin-related crime was to increase enforcement efforts and to increase incarceration of people involved in heroin-related offenses. The police expanded their enforcement activities against heroin dealers and against people found in possession of heroin. The courts increased the severity of sentences imposed on people convicted of heroin-related crimes. The prisons became increasingly crowded with heroin users, with people who had turned to crime to support their heroin addiction, and with heroin dealers who were supplying the black market demand for the drug. The assumption underlying this increasingly aggressive enforcement was that increasing punishment would deter heroin use and heroin trafficking. But the evidence suggests that the increases in enforcement and incarceration had little impact on the overall prevalence of heroin addiction or on the availability of heroin through black market sources. The medical profession's response to the continuing heroin crisis during the Depression was characterized by continued confusion and continued adherence to the belief that heroin addiction was fundamentally a criminal rather than a medical problem. Some physicians continued to view heroin addiction as a moral failing requiring punishment and deterrence rather than as a medical condition requiring treatment. Other physicians recognized that heroin addiction was a medical problem, but were unable to treat it effectively given that heroin was illegal and was therefore unavailable for legitimate medical use. The absence of any established treatment framework for heroin addiction meant that the medical profession had essentially abandoned people suffering from heroin addiction, leaving them to the criminal justice system. The few attempts that were made during this period to develop effective treatments for heroin addiction were constrained by the legal framework that had been created by Prohibition. Dr. Vincent Dole, an American physician who was conducting research on addiction mechanisms during this period, later observed that the prohibition of heroin made it impossible to conduct the kind of research that would have been necessary to understand addiction and to develop effective treatment approaches. Dole argued that Prohibition had essentially frozen the development of addiction treatment at a point that was far short of what would have been possible if research could have continued into how heroin affected the brain and how people could be helped to overcome heroin addiction. The Prohibition approach, which was intended to eliminate heroin use, had instead eliminated the possibility of research into understanding and treating heroin addiction. The impact of the Depression on the expatriate community in Paris was catastrophic and led to the exodus of many of the American writers, artists, and other expatriates who had made Paris their home. The exchange rate advantages that had made Paris affordable for American expatriates with limited resources disappeared with the economic collapse. American expatriates who lacked independent sources of income found that they could no longer afford to live in Paris and were forced to return to the United States or to find other destinations where they could survive on their limited resources. The departure of large numbers of American expatriates from Paris disrupted the artistic and intellectual communities that had developed during the 1920s, and meant that Paris lost much of the cultural vitality and the artistic productivity that had characterized the expatriate era. For heroin-dependent expatriates, the decision to leave Paris or the necessity of remaining in Paris due to inability to afford transportation home created additional hardships. Those who left Paris faced the challenge of maintaining their heroin addiction in countries where heroin was either illegal or significantly more expensive and less available than it had been in Paris. Those who remained in Paris faced the continuing challenge of obtaining black market heroin while attempting to survive the economic devastation of the Depression. The intersection of heroin addiction, economic desperation, and the disruption of the expatriate community created conditions of extraordinary human suffering. The women who had been heroin users, and particularly the society women who had been dependent on heroin as a means of managing the stress of maintaining their social roles, faced particular hardships during the Depression. The economic collapse eliminated the resources that had allowed these women to maintain their heroin addiction through private physicians and private clinics. The prohibition of heroin meant that women who had been obtaining pharmaceutical heroin through medical channels could no longer do so. The stigma associated with heroin addiction and the criminalization of heroin use meant that these women could not seek help without risking exposure of their addiction and the social consequences that such exposure would entail. Many women who had been heroin users during the 1920s attempted to overcome their addiction during the Depression, found themselves unable to do so without medical support that was unavailable, and either died from the consequences of their addiction or lived lives of continuing suffering and desperation. The children who had grown up in families affected by heroin addiction during the 1920s and who lived through the combined crises of Prohibition and the Depression carried forward the psychological impacts of having lived in households disrupted by heroin addiction and by the social consequences of Prohibition and criminalization. These children had grown up with parents whose emotional availability was uncertain and whose behavior was unpredictable, had learned to manage family situations characterized by economic desperation and by the constant threat of parental incarceration or death. The children had absorbed lessons about the power of chemical substances to shape human experience, about the importance of obtaining access to scarce resources like heroin or money, and about the unpredictability and danger inherent in adult human behavior. The psychological effects of having grown up under these conditions would continue throughout these children's lives, affecting their capacity to form healthy relationships, to manage their own emotional experiences, and to maintain productive engagement with society. The artistic and intellectual contributions that might have emerged from the expatriate community in Paris were diminished or eliminated by the heroin epidemic and by the combination of prohibition and economic collapse that followed. Writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who had been heroin users, continued to produce work following their departure from Paris or following their discontinuation of heroin use. But their productivity and the quality of their work were affected by their experiences with heroin and by the trauma of heroin withdrawal and the struggle to overcome heroin addiction. Other artists and writers who were less successful in overcoming heroin addiction saw their careers derailed or destroyed by heroin dependence. The artistic and intellectual innovations that might have emerged from these talented individuals had they not become involved with heroin remain unknown, a form of cultural loss that resulted from the heroin epidemic. The role of the French government and the international community in implementing heroin prohibition without having developed any plan for treating people who were already addicted to heroin represented a profound ethical failure. The decision to criminalize heroin possession and use without providing any alternative means for people to manage their heroin addiction essentially condemned thousands of people to years of suffering, to incarceration, to overdose death, and to the other destructive consequences that followed from prohibition. The assumption that prohibition would eliminate heroin use proved to be disastrously wrong. But by the time the harmful consequences of prohibition became apparent, the policies had been implemented and were being enforced with increasing severity across multiple countries. The historical record of the heroin epidemic in Paris and of the governmental response to the epidemic reveals a pattern that would be repeated again and again in responses to drug epidemics throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The pattern involves the failure to recognize an emerging problem until it has become severe, the adoption of ineffective policies based on flawed assumptions about how addiction works and how behavior change can be achieved, the implementation of punitive and criminalization-focused responses that intensify suffering without addressing the underlying problem, the absence of any serious examination of whether the policies are actually working, and the perpetuation of failed policies long after evidence has accumulated that they are ineffective. The legacy of the Paris heroin epidemic and of the prohibition response to the epidemic extends far beyond the immediate impacts on the thousands of people who were directly affected by heroin addiction in Paris. The policies that were developed in response to the Paris crisis, policies that made heroin illegal, that criminalized heroin possession and use, and that treated heroin addiction as a criminal rather than a medical problem, were exported to other countries and were incorporated into international drug control treaties that continue to govern drug policy in many countries today. The fundamental approach to heroin and to drug addiction more broadly that emerged from the Paris crisis, an approach based on prohibition, criminalization, and punishment, has dominated drug policy for more than 90 years despite accumulating evidence that this approach has failed to eliminate drug addiction while creating enormous secondary harms. The economic impacts of heroin prohibition extended far beyond the direct effects on heroin users and traffickers to affect legitimate businesses and economic activities. The prohibition of heroin eliminated an entire industry that had been involved in manufacturing, distributing, and selling heroin as a legitimate pharmaceutical product. The shift from pharmaceutical to black market heroin distribution created opportunities for criminal organizations, but eliminated legitimate economic activities. The resources devoted to law enforcement and incarceration in response to heroin-related crime represented resources that were diverted from other productive uses. The crimes committed by heroin-dependent people to obtain money to purchase heroin created economic losses for the victims of these crimes. The overall economic impact of the heroin epidemic and of the prohibition response to the epidemic was massively negative. The recovery and reconstruction of Parisian artistic and cultural life following the devastation of the heroin epidemic and the Depression occurred gradually over several decades and was never complete in the sense that the cultural vitality of the expatriate era was never fully recaptured. Some of the expatriate writers and artists who had been part of the heroin scene in 1920s Paris survived their heroin addiction and went on to produce important literary and artistic work in subsequent decades, though their work was often marked by the trauma of their experiences with addiction and by the physical and psychological consequences of heroin use and heroin withdrawal. Others who had been prominent figures in the artistic community of 1920s Paris either died from the direct or indirect consequences of heroin addiction or disappeared from public view and produced little of significance following their heroin-using years. The international drug control regime that emerged from the League of Nations Convention on Heroin and from subsequent international treaties established frameworks that would govern drug policy for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st century. The prohibition approach to heroin control that was established through these international agreements became the dominant model for drug policy worldwide, despite continuing evidence that the approach was ineffective in eliminating heroin use, and was successful primarily in creating enormous secondary harms and in establishing the conditions for the emergence of organized criminal drug trafficking networks. The commitment to heroin prohibition became so deeply embedded in international law and in national drug policies that alternatives to prohibition remained politically and legally impossible to implement in most countries for decades. The medical understanding of heroin addiction advanced significantly in the decades following the 1920s and 1930s through research that documented how heroin affected the brain, how addiction developed, and how people could potentially be helped to overcome addiction. This research revealed that heroin addiction involved fundamental changes in brain chemistry and neurological function. That addiction was not a matter of moral failing or lack of willpower, but rather was a biological condition that required medical intervention to overcome. The research also revealed that maintenance approaches to addiction, approaches that involved providing heroin or heroin-like substances to people who were addicted to heroin, could be effective in allowing addicted individuals to function productively and safely. However, the prohibition approach to heroin created legal barriers that prevented the implementation of these evidence-based treatment approaches in most countries. The emergence of methadone maintenance therapy in the 1960s and 1970s represented a significant development in the treatment of heroin addiction, and represented vindication of the approach that Vincent Dole and other researchers had advocated during the crisis years of the 1920s and 1930s. Methadone maintenance therapy involved providing heroin-dependent individuals with methadone, a long-acting synthetic opioid that could prevent withdrawal symptoms and that could allow addicted individuals to function productively while they gradually reduced their use. The implementation of methadone maintenance programs in the United States and in other countries demonstrated that evidence-based medical approaches to heroin addiction could reduce the harms associated with heroin use, could help people overcome heroin addiction, and could allow people to reintegrate into productive social roles. However, even with the emergence of evidence-based treatment approaches like methadone maintenance, the legal and policy framework established during the 1920s and 1930s continued to constrain the implementation of these approaches. The prohibition of heroin made it legally impossible in most jurisdictions to prescribe heroin itself as a treatment for heroin addiction, making methadone and other synthetic opioids the primary tools for medically managing heroin addiction. The continued criminalization of heroin possession and use meant that people struggling with heroin addiction often found themselves in the criminal justice system rather than in the medical system, limiting their access to treatment and perpetuating the cycle of incarceration and addiction. The comparison between the heroin epidemic in 1920s Paris and subsequent drug epidemics that emerged in later decades and in other locations reveals striking similarities in the pattern of initial denial or underestimation of the problem, the adoption of prohibition and criminalization as the primary response, the failure to implement treatment and public health approaches, and the emergence of organized crime and black market trafficking in response to prohibition. The opioid epidemic that emerged in the United States in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, driven primarily by pharmaceutical opioid prescribing and by black market heroin and fentanyl, repeats many of the same patterns that were evident in the Paris heroin epidemic. The failure of societies to learn from the historical experience of the Paris epidemic and to adopt different approaches to emerging drug problems has resulted in the perpetuation of harmful policies and the perpetuation of suffering on a massive scale. The role of pharmaceutical innovation and pharmaceutical marketing in creating drug epidemics is another theme that emerges clearly from the history of the Paris heroin epidemic, and that is repeated in subsequent drug epidemics. The initial development and marketing of heroin by Bayer as a safe and effective pharmaceutical product, the aggressive promotion of heroin to physicians and to the public, and the failure of the pharmaceutical company to adequately warn about addiction risks all contributed to the creation of conditions in which widespread heroin addiction could develop. Similar patterns have been evident in the marketing of other pharmaceutical products with high addiction potential, including OxyContin and other prescription opioids that have been heavily marketed to physicians and patients in recent decades. The ultimate legacy of the heroin epidemic in 1920s Paris remains deeply ambivalent, a history that contains lessons about human vulnerability and human resilience, about the power of chemical substances to shape human experience and human society, about the consequences of failed policy responses to emergent crises, and about the enduring impacts of historical experiences on the policies and institutions that persist into subsequent generations. The Paris heroin epidemic was a tragedy in the classical sense, a catastrophe that emerged not from evil conspiracy or deliberate malice, but from the collision of well-intentioned efforts to advance human welfare, ignorance about fundamental biological and psychological mechanisms, and institutional interests in profit and control. The suffering that resulted from the heroin epidemic was immense, was borne disproportionately by the most vulnerable and most talented members of society, and was magnified rather than alleviated by the governmental and international policy responses that were adopted in response to the crisis. The artistic and intellectual contributions that emerged from those who experienced the heroin epidemic in Paris and survived it constitute a form of cultural record of what addiction feels like, what the experience of chemical dependency is like, and what the consequences of addiction are for human relationships and human creativity. The writings of authors who had experienced heroin addiction, the visual artwork of artists who had struggled with heroin dependence, the music of musicians who had used heroin while creating some of their most significant works, all of these artistic and intellectual products provide subsequent generations with testimony about the experience of addiction and about the ways that addiction transforms human experience. This artistic record has contributed to understanding of addiction and has served as a form of warning about the seductive power of substances that promise enhancement while ultimately diminishing human capacity. The historical study of the heroin epidemic in Paris has contributed to the development of more nuanced understanding of addiction as a phenomenon that involves biological, psychological, social, and economic dimensions, and that cannot be adequately addressed through approaches that focus exclusively on any one of these dimensions. The recognition that heroin addiction emerged from the legitimate pharmaceutical development of a substance intended to relieve suffering, that heroin addiction was perpetuated by physicians acting with the belief that they were providing appropriate medical care. and that heroin addiction was exacerbated rather than eliminated by prohibition and criminalization, has contributed to recognition that effective responses to drug epidemics must involve public health approaches combined with harm reduction strategies and with access to evidence-based treatment. The continuing relevance of the heroin epidemic in Paris to contemporary drug policy debates is evident in ongoing discussions about the optimal approach to addressing opioid epidemics, about the balance between law enforcement and public health responses, about the role of pharmaceutical companies in creating and promoting addictive substances, and about the potential value of harm reduction approaches that acknowledge the reality of addiction and seek to minimize the harms associated with addiction, rather than simply attempting to eliminate drug use through prohibition and punishment. The arguments that were made by those advocating for evidence-based approaches to heroin addiction in the 1920s and 1930s, arguments about the necessity of medical treatment, about the ineffectiveness of prohibition, about the importance of maintaining access to pharmaceutical solutions for those who are addicted, are being made again in contemporary debates about how to address opioid epidemics and other drug crises. The question of whether contemporary societies will learn from the historical experience of the Paris heroin epidemic and will adopt more effective and more humane approaches to drug epidemics remains open. The evidence suggests that the same patterns that emerged in response to the Paris heroin epidemic continue to characterize contemporary responses to drug crises: the tendency toward prohibition and criminalization, the resistance to treating addiction as a medical condition, the failure to implement harm reduction and evidence-based treatment approaches, the perpetuation of failed policies long after evidence has accumulated that they are ineffective. The perpetuation of these patterns suggests that the lessons of the Paris heroin epidemic have not been adequately learned, or that the institutional and political forces that maintain current drug policies are sufficiently powerful to prevent the implementation of different approaches even when evidence suggests that change would be beneficial. The human dimensions of the heroin epidemic in Paris, the suffering of individuals and families affected by addiction, the destruction of creative talent and human potential, the trauma experienced by those who survived addiction and by those who lost loved ones to the epidemic, provide a profound moral imperative to ensure that future responses to drug crises are more effective and more humane than the responses to the Paris epidemic. The individuals whose lives were affected by the heroin epidemic in Paris were not abstractions or historical curiosities, but were real human beings whose suffering was immense and whose lives were fundamentally altered by their encounters with heroin and by the social policies that responded to heroin use with criminalization and punishment. The recognition of Paris in the 1920s as the site of the world's first modern drug epidemic is important not because the event was unique, but because it was the first historical instance in which the patterns that would characterize subsequent drug epidemics became clearly visible. The mechanisms through which legitimate pharmaceutical innovation and pharmaceutical marketing could create widespread addiction, the ways that addiction could spread through social and cultural networks, the failure of medical and governmental institutions to adequately recognize and respond to emerging problems, the adoption of punishment and criminalization as responses to addiction, the emergence of black market criminal networks to supply heroin when pharmaceutical supply was eliminated. All of these patterns that emerged clearly in Paris in the 1920s would be repeated again and again in subsequent decades with different drugs, in different locations, but following essentially the same trajectories. The story of the heroin epidemic in 1920s Paris is ultimately a story about human vulnerability and human capacity for both resilience and destruction. It is a story about how well-intentioned innovations can have devastating consequences when deployed without adequate understanding of their potential harms. It is a story about how cultural values and practices can facilitate the spread of addiction and can make harmful behaviors seem sophisticated and desirable. It is a story about how governmental policies can magnify rather than alleviate suffering when they are based on flawed assumptions and when they lack adequate mechanisms for responding to unintended consequences. And it is a story that provides a profound warning about the necessity of integrating evidence-based approaches into policy responses to emerging health crises, about the importance of maintaining focus on human welfare rather than on symbolic victories in the war on drugs, and about the devastating costs of perpetuating policies that have been demonstrated to be ineffective and harmful. As we consider the contemporary drug landscape, the opioid epidemics affecting multiple countries, and the ongoing debates about how to respond to drug addiction and drug trafficking, the history of the heroin epidemic in 1920s Paris provides essential context and essential lessons. The lessons are clear. Prohibition and criminalization do not eliminate addiction. Medical and public health approaches are necessary components of effective responses to drug crises. The voices and experiences of those affected by addiction must inform policy development. And the perpetuation of policies that cause harm even when evidence demonstrates their ineffectiveness represents a profound failure of social and governmental institutions to fulfill their obligations to protect human welfare.